Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Gangsters vs. Nazis, How Jewish Mobsters Battled Nazis in Wartime America, by Michael Benson, narrated by Gabriel Vaughan. Introduction. The Sock on the Jaw. So we raided the joint. We went over there and grabbed everything in sight, all their bullshit signs, and smacked the shit out of them, broke them up the best we could. Nobody could pay me for this work. It was my patriotic duty. Mickey Cohen, 1938. I've been a comic book fan since the days when they cost only 12 cents apiece, which would be the mid-60s. Back then, 6 empty Coke bottles for a comic book was an even trade at the corner store. I've collected them, studied their history, and marveled at their adaptations into blockbuster summer movies. So I can state with confidence that the greatest comic book cover in the history of the art form is Captain America Comics #1, drawn by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. The comic was a product of Timely Comics, which would later change its name to Marvel. Cover dated March 1941, CAC #1 hit newsstands a week before Christmas 1940. The date is important because it is close to a year before Pearl Harbor and the United States' forced entry into the Second World War. In 1940, Adolph Hitler had just about conquered Europe and was bombing military and civilian targets in Great Britain. Jews were being brutalized and killed. Hitler's Italian allies had military control of the northern portion of Africa, and the Japanese had conquered large chunks of Asia and the islands of the Pacific. But there were still many in America who felt the country had no dog in the fight. American fascists argued that Hitler had the right idea because Jewish bankers and Jewish communists were behind the Great Depression that had painted 1930s America a dingy gray. The bright red, white, and blue Captain America, as it turned out, was having none of that. Cap was the formerly puny Steve Rogers of Brooklyn, New York, who had been transformed by scientists wielding hypodermic needles into a super soldier, a human being single-handedly capable of giving the Axis powers shaky knees. The cover of CAC #1 was Cap's introduction to the youth of America. It showed him bursting into Hitler's inner sanctum, coolly deflecting Nazi bullets from several guards with his star-spangled shield, and planting a devastating right cross onto Hitler's jaw. The meaning was clear. The evil Nazis needed gats, but even armed, they were no match for a knuckle sandwich dished out by a red-blooded American boy. Of course, it was a dreamland, a pleasant fantasy for boys who might one day see action in the service of their country. But in some cities in America during the 1930s and the Great Depression, punching Nazis was a reality. And though none of the punchers wore a star-spangled costume, and some of the punchers might not have seemed the type, they were all superheroes. Since the end of World War II and the reveal of the Holocaust's horrors, the predominant images of Jews versus Nazis were photographs of the liberation of the concentration camps, the starved Jewish men and women and children who'd survived, and the dead, the uncountable dead. Though we must never forget that nightmare, lest it happen again, I submit this additional volume to the Jews versus Nazis story, a volume in which tough American gangsters, like Meyer Lansky, Longy Zwillman, Sparky Rubenstein, Mickey Cohen, Abraham Kid Twist Rellis, Bugsy Goldstein, and Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss, along with journalists like Herb Bryn and prize-fighters Barney Ross, Nat Arno, Abby Bain, and Putty Hinks, saw the evil of the Nazi menace during the late 1930s and, as would Captain America, socked it on the jaw. This is the story of those epic fights between Hitler's American armies, one known as the American Deutscher Volksbund, or the German-American Bund, and another as the Silver Legion, and those who took on those uniformed stormtroopers in fisticuffs and battle royale brawls, an army of patriots composed of Jewish Americans, demonstrating from coast to coast that a Nazi, too, could have problems. While most Americans did not know the extent of Hitler's systemic genocide until after World War II, America's Jewish communities knew that large-scale bad things were happening. In America, Jewish communities received letters from their European relatives that described the rounding up of Jews, with no one returning home. So when a Jewish man heard the anti-Semitic slanders of the Nazi sympathizers, he knew where that hate speech was headed. Responding with violence didn't bother his conscience. Make no mistake, the gangsters in this book are the good guys. To explain why, we turn to Myron Sugarman, the son of Barney Sugarman, who fought Nazis on the mean streets of Newark, New Jersey. Myron grew up with these guys, and in 2016 he told Robert Wiener of New Jersey Jewish News about the Nazi wars during the Depression. For him, the stories of hoods busting Nazi noses were bedtime stories. Myron rejected the notion that his father or any of the others could be considered a villain in any way. Gangsters. It was just a word. The word should have been survivors. If a Palestinian Jew was born in Newark, he'd be a gangster, Myron said matter-of-factly. The Jewish mob has done the world a hell of a lot of good. It was instrumental in the creation of Israel. If there'd been a Jewish mob in Germany in 1923 during the Beer Hall Putsch, they'd have shot Hitler, and history would have been a hell of a lot different. For the ghetto of Newark, the Jewish mob was like the police. If the Goyim came in looking to pick on Jews, the real police weren't going to do anything about it. The gangsters were the protectors. They beat up the Nazis and eventually got rid of them, Myron recalled. Preamble. Fade in. It is important to non-Jews as well as to Jews. Any nation which permits a minority to live in fear of persecution is a nation which invites disaster. Professor L.B. Namier. Fade in. Time, July 1938, 9 p.m. Exterior. An assembly hall in Depression-era America. From inside, we hear the muffled sounds of laughter and shouting. A party. Perhaps a celebration. For an instant, we see a small cluster of men outside the hall, faces darkened with burnt cork, maybe a dozen of them, dressed in dark clothes and clinging to the shadows. They move with silent steps. A tracking shot takes us through a side window for a peek inside the hall, where we see what has to be 800 Nazis, with their Hitler haircuts and Hitler uniforms, crammed in like riders on a rush-hour subway car, sweating through their brown shirts in the stifling heat. Though perspiring plentifully, they remain kempt to the extreme. We see a close-up of a swastika pin on one man's brown lapel. Interior. We see the Nazis in greater detail now, a montage of faces, ruddy and dim. The men speak in guttural voices, loud with inebriation and emboldened by their numbers. Some wave around copies of Mein Kampf as if they are magic swords. Along the rear wall, behind the podium, hangs a red banner with a black swastika on it. Beside it, slightly smaller and hung lower, is Old Glory, the stars and stripes of the United States of America. A uniformed man stands at a lectern, trying in vain to call the boisterous meeting to order. Behind him are two framed portraits, one of Adolph Hitler, the other, slightly smaller, of George Washington. Pan to the lobby, just inside the front doors, one side of which is a bar where German lager is pouring freely, quaffed in giant gulps. The backs of soft pink hands wipe foam from truncated mustaches. The lights dim for a moment, letting those at the bar know that the meeting is about to begin. There is a move to enter the meeting room, but gridlock stops the men. Many will have to listen from the lobby. Exterior. We see the cluster of shadowy men more clearly now. There are more than we thought before, perhaps 3 dozen, breaking up into groups, one in front of the hall, one to either side, covering all 3 exits. Their pockets bulge ominously. Some are holding weapons in their hands, sawed-off pool cues, blackjacks, baseball bats. If there was one thing an American Jew is bound to learn, whether or not he makes it out of grammar school, it is how to swing a baseball bat. We see a close-up of one man putting brass knuckles onto the fingers of his right hand. Look closely, and you can see that some of those tough guys have had their pictures in the paper. A strike force of underworld soldiers, bosses, and well-known prize-fighters. Look, there's the former bootleg king himself, airboxing in anticipation. The three groups enter the hall simultaneously. They don't get far inside before they hit the gridlock, and the action commences suddenly, like a fizzy chemical reaction. The crowd loosens as frightened Nazis flee out the front and side exits. The scene instantly transforms into a seething turmoil of angry, fighting men. Teeth shatter, jaws dislocate, bruises and welts rise like sudden volcanoes. The Nazis are getting by far the worst of it. Crimson stains blotch crisp brown shirts. Folding chairs fly through the air. In a side hallway running alongside the main room is a glass display case filled with group photographs and trophies in commemoration of long-forgotten achievements. A display case that abruptly acquires a sideweb of cracks when struck by a Nazi's sloping forehead. Half crazed with pain and fear, blood now streaming down his face, the Nazi stumbles and falls. As the savagery escalates, a man at the podium yells into a microphone, "Halt! Halt!" Through broken lips, a German-American asks, "Who are these invaders? Who has ruined us?" "Call us the true Americans," a man with a rubber truncheon says with a toothy grin. "Whenever you Jew-haters get together," says another, examining his bloody knuckles, "we will be on the scene in a flash and send you to the hospital." With that, he socks a Nazi across the jaw with a devastating right hand, sending his foe to the floor in a heap. The Nazi at the podium is shoved aside, and a gangster takes the microphone. "Look, look! This is what we do to Hitler's clowns!" Part 1. The Cloven Hoof. Once evil is invited in, tremendous effort is required to show it to the door and kick its cloven hoof off the threshold. E. A. Bucchianeri. Chapter 1. Jewish Gangsters. The Jewish migration to the United States began in the 19th century, largely from Central Europe. Jews arrived alone or in families, speaking a variety of languages: German, Yiddish, Polish, Romanian, Hungarian, etc., dressing in the Old World style and retaining their Orthodox piety. The largest number came from Russia, where they had grown increasingly unwelcomed in their own villages, in their own homes. In 1881, laws were passed that limited the Jewish population's access to rural areas, forcing them into overcrowded villages in the western provinces. Even then, they fled the shtetls, as government-stimulated pogroms, the Russian word for devastation, flattened their homes and turned their eyes to the New World. In 1882, there were about 250,000 Jews in the United States. By 1924, that number had grown to 4 million. With each generation, Jews in the New World modernized and Americanized, both in dress and style of worship, until the fourth decade of the 20th century, when they were as much in search of the American dream as were the blue bloods that could trace their roots back to Plymouth Rock. That dream was most in focus when it was projected onto silver screens inside palace theaters built by Jewish moguls like Marcus Loew and Adolph Hitler. As a centerpiece of Jewish communities, however, the cinema remained for most Jews only a distant second to the synagogue. Temple was the primary gathering place, providing both spiritual and social services. For most Jews, but not all. While some Jews' lives were dominated by Old World religious practices, services twice a day, strict dietary laws, separation by gender, abstinence from labor on the Sabbath, Hebrew classes for the men, ritual baths for the women, and such. There were also teenaged boys of the 1920s who sought to avoid a life of shopkeeping or factory drudgery and planned to go into other fields, like crime. They caused their fathers to pray for their lost souls and broke their mothers' hearts. They ran wild, became rebellious to the bone, played hooky, and snuck into the movies. They formed gangs and fought over turf sometimes as small as a lone street corner. They rebelled for a reason. They were observant and saw how things were. Jews in America were not free to pursue happiness to anywhere near the extent that Gentiles enjoyed. Christians blocked many pathways to prosperity, so Jews became shopkeepers, butchers, tailors, and so on, for the simple reason that these were the jobs they were allowed to have. They worked hard, and they remained poor. Rebellious young men decided not to follow in their fathers' footsteps, and rather took up career paths via which a Jew could become rich: show business, boxing, and, of course, the rackets. Teenage Jewish gang members graduated into organized crime. During the 1920s, that meant bootlegging. When Prohibition was repealed, they moved into other rackets: policy banking, also known as the numbers, an illegal lottery, extortion, murder, sometimes losing their Jewish accents in favor of a cheap imitation of movie gangsters like Jimmy Cagney and Edward G. Robinson. Like all boys, they kept their heroes close to their hearts: baseball players, fighters, but especially Jewish gangsters. To borrow a phrase from historian Rich Cohen, Jewish boys had a favorite gangster the way Catholics have patron saints. They imagined the Jewish hoods to be just as cool as the Hollywood actors who portrayed them, and they were often right. Jewish gangsters did not cower from danger. They were the danger. The prototypical Jewish gangster was Edward Osterman, whose cowlicks rendered his hair comb-resistant, sticking up in the back like alfalfas, no matter how many glops of Murray's Superior pomade he applied. His cratered face was an homage to the smallpox he'd survived. Even as a young man, Osterman was jowly, with thick lips pulled into a perpetual sneer. His nose was flat, or had been flattened so it was difficult to see in profile. He was known on the street as Monk Eastman, born in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, son of a restaurant owner. His dad had tried to set up Monk in business, but Monk had other ideas and took a bouncer job at New Irving Hall. The establishment would later clean up its act and become known as the Yiddish Art Theater, but when Monk worked there, it was a rough joint, and he made a name for himself by wading into fights and tossing the combatants on their ears into the bricked street out front. Tough guys tried to take him on, bigger men, but Monk had fists of lightning, threw short and accurate punches to damaging effect. He was so tough that, despite his unruly hair and pocked face, women loved him 1, 2, 3. But even the toughest men are not bulletproof. Monk mixed with ambitious criminals and didn't live to be old. Shot 5 times and killed in front of a 14th Street cafe on December 26, 1920. The next famous superstar Jewish gangster to come down the pike was Arnold the Brain Rothstein, who grew up rich on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. His father, Abe, was a successful businessman known for his kindness and called by his neighbors Abe the Just. That kindness didn't wear off on his son. Arnold had cold, dark eyes that made all in his company feel inferior, insignificant perhaps. He had "I'd rather kill you than look at you" eyes, flanking a hawk's nose, downward pointing and sharp. He wasn't much of a smiler, but when he did smile, he grinned as if appreciating his own sadistic joke. Rothstein could have been a lazy pretty boy, but instead became a lone wolf, seeking adventure and profit, slumming as much as he could, hanging with the tough guy Jewish boys of the ghetto. In 1909, he married a shiksa, a cooperative actress named Carolyn Green. His wealthy dad disowned him, freed him, in essence, and Arnold never looked back. He became a professional gambler, opened a series of backroom gambling parlors. Eventually, he opened a Palace Casino on 46th Street in Midtown Manhattan, ornate in the same fashion as the Loews State and Paramount theaters in nearby Times Square. Opulence was very hip back then. Customers were more apt to empty their wallets if their very surroundings made them feel rich. When Rothstein had sufficient funds, he became the underworld's #1 financier, offering loans with an outrageously large vig, making him the most powerful Jew in America. One of the ways he made so much cabbage was fixing games. Small games like roulette and big games like baseball. He fixed the 1919 World Series in what came to be known as the Black Sox scandal. Rothstein was already flying pretty high when the Volstead Act tried to dry America out, and he was quick to hop the bootleg whiskey train. When it came to running and enforcing his empire, Rothstein proved to be a remarkable judge of criminal talent and recruited a veritable future mob hall of fame. Jewish gangsters and their Italian cousins, too. Rothstein hired on Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Lepke Buchalter, men who will be among the heroes of our story. Later, when Lansky advised Lucky Luciano as Luch designed the five-family system, not everyone was thrilled with a Jew having the ear of the capo di tutti I capi. Boss Vito Genovese didn't like it, didn't like to mix. Frank Costello, on the other hand, looked at Lansky and all he could see were dollar signs. Lansky recalled the first time he ever locked eyes with Luciano. They were just kids at the time, face to face in Little Italy, a tiny enclave in Lower Manhattan tucked between Chinatown and the East Village. Lansky and Luciano both felt it, the shared attitude. Fuck the world. Fuck the whole fucking universe. They were gangsters among gangsters. Later, when they worked together in the casino biz, they were like an old married couple, finishing each other's sentences, sometimes understanding without speaking at all. It was funny. Other than running the rackets, the two men had nothing in common. Rothstein was a powerful man. He was the model for the character Meyer Wolfsheim in F. Scott Fitzgerald's 1925 novel, The Great Gatsby. But he still had his private peccadillos and was no more bulletproof than Monk Eastman. On November 4th, 1928, Rothstein received a phone call at Lindy's restaurant telling him to come to the Park Central Hotel, catty-corner from Carnegie Hall. Rothstein strode confidently into the hotel okay, but he came out on a stretcher with a bullet in his guts. Murder, Inc.'s Albert Anastasia was shot in the same building a generation later, dead on the floor of Grasso's barber shop off the hotel lobby. Rothstein survived for 2 days before succumbing to his wounds. He was 46 and was buried in the Union Field Cemetery in the Ridgewood section of Queens. The year after Rothstein was killed, the stock market crashed. Unemployment went sky high, and the Great Depression covered America like a smoky blanket of despair. In that atmosphere, more Jewish boys than ever turned to lives of crime. Jewish gangs ruled their turf and fought rumbles with rival gangs. In the gangs, many Jewish boys found a brotherhood that they couldn't find at home or school. In the gangs, boys met others who were the same, Jews who were unafraid. They grew to be adult gangsters, who in turn became the idols of the next generation of boys who were tired of being bullied by thick-necked Gentiles. As the fascist menace grew to crisis proportions in New York City, Meyer Lansky became the nation's top Jewish gangster and would be the one to lead the anti-Nazi effort there. Chapter 2. Rise of Fascism. To put it simply, fascism is the belief that a dictatorial leader is preferable to an elected one because many voters are enemies of the people and need to be oppressed. As a philosophy, it requires a strong leader and a weaker scapegoat. In Germany, Hitler became the dictator and Jews the scapegoat. Hitler preached of Aryan supremacy, the notion that healthy white Germans were the only ones who mattered, and certainly the only ones who should be allowed to make decisions. Fascism always gains popularity during times of economic crisis, so it was no coincidence that its rise in Europe and in the United States coincided with the Great Depression, which caused global hardship. In Germany, there was mass discrimination and violence based on racial, ethnic, sexual, and religious identities. Hatred of Jews, commonly known as anti-Semitism, was a linchpin of Hitler's version of fascism, which he called Nazism, a contraction of National Socialism. Hitler's plans didn't stop at stifling and eventually eliminating Jewish people. He wanted to rule the world, and during the 1930s, he stomped over smaller and weaker European nations until only England stood between him and the United States. The last thing Hitler wanted was to fight the U.S., whose entry into the First World War had halted German aggression. His plan was to convince Americans that Germany was their friend and Jews were the enemy. In America, German immigrants were second only to the Irish in number, and they were recruited to organize and form paramilitary groups that would echo the Third Reich's noxious philosophies, first and foremost, that Jewish people were behind the world's problems. And so, organizations sprung up. The first was the Friends of the New Germany, created through the auspices of the German consul in New York City, but it suffered from bad press, which proclaimed it un-American. As if by magic, the Friends transformed into the Amerika-Deutscher Volksbund, the German-American Bund, under new leadership. Try and call that unpatriotic. Now it said American right in its name. But it was, of course, just a game of semantics. The new Bund had one goal: promote Hitler's agenda. That included spreading hate toward Jews and non-white Christians and keeping American soldiers the hell out of Europe. Unless they wanted to fight on Hitler's side, that would have been all right. The Bund would convince its followers that America's urge to defend Great Britain was the product of a communist/Jewish conspiracy. When the Bund members assembled peacefully, they defended their hateful message by holding up the U.S. Constitution. They had freedom of speech on their side. They had the right to assemble. True, opponents noted, but in this case there was a sharp distinction between legal and just. From the start, the Bund expertly manipulated the minds of its followers. It advertised itself as an organization of Americans of German stock. The stages at rallies were always neat and precise, with American flags and swastikas side by side. The initial Bundists looked back as much as forward, regretting the loss of the Great War and calling for Germany's return to greatness. They acted like little soldiers with uniforms. They recruited children to their German-American camps, where pro-Hitler brainwashing accompanied the swimming and playing. Some German Americans ate it up, but not all. As you hear these stories, remember that the great majority of Americans, including those of German heritage, saw through the Bund's message. They recognized hate when they saw it. There were upward of 12 million Germans in the United States during the Depression, and Bund membership represented only 0.2% of that number, 1 in 500. But the believers, that 0.2%, were zealous and dangerous. By 1933, there were more than 100 anti-Semitic groups in the U.S., functioning openly and in evangelical mode. American Nazis preached that Germany and the U.S. could get along if it weren't for the Jews, who were unthinkably powerful, had all the money, and were pushing the two countries in the direction of war. They would hoist the swastika flag and Sieg Heil to their heart's delight. They had parades, practiced their goose-stepping, and published magazines filled to the margins with disinformation. Jews had horns and belonged in hell. Fake news before the term existed. The Bund communicated with its 50,000 members via a weekly newspaper known as the Deutscher Weckruf und Beobachter, the German wake-up call and observer. The message appealed to some non-German Americans as well. Among these were isolationists, who felt the U.S. should never fight someone else's battle, largely the same group that kept the U.S. out of the First World War until the very end.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?